evening and welcome to our live stream. Thank you for joining this artist lecture and talk with James Bridle tonight. We have this talk on the occasion of our exhibition Beyond States, the Boundaries of Statehood, which is now open to visitors. But if you can't make it to Friedrichshafen, you can also explore the exhibition online via our debatorial website. I'm Caroline Wind, one of the co-curators of this exhibition, and I would like to warmly welcome our guest, James Bridle. Hello, James. And also my colleague, Ina Neddermeyer, who will give us the questions from the community later. Hello, Ina. So please send us your questions on the debatorial website, on Facebook, YouTube, or via email. You can comment in German, so we will translate it. Before we start, I would like to give a short introduction on James Bridle. He's an artist, curator, and writer working across technologies and disciplines. He holds a master's degree in computer science and cognitive science from University College London and wrote a dissertation on creative applications of artificial intelligence. His artworks and installations have been showed in many exhibitions and museums worldwide, like in the MoMA, the Axioma in Ljubljana, or the Hack in Basel, and have been viewed by many visitors online. He has been honored for his work by Ars Electronica, the Japan Media Arts Festival, and the Design Museum London. In 2015, James Bridle was among the 100 most influential people in Europe by Wired magazine. You can read his articles and his writing in magazines and newspapers like The Guardian, Frieze, Wired, and many others. In 2018, he published the book New Dark Age about technology and the end of the future, which, by the way, I would highly recommend. It's really interesting. I haven't finished yet, but I've already learned a lot, so read it. Well, there would be a lot more to say, but I will stop talking now and hand over to James. It's your turn.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Caroline. Thank you, Ina, for this invitation. Thank you to the museum for hosting the show. I would love to see it. Yeah, it looks like a fantastic show, and I'm very happy to be part of it. And I'm glad this isn't the first time, as Will mentioned, that I've worked and shown work at the Zeppelin Museum. So it's really nice to build this connection. I'm really happy to give a talk this evening about the works that are featured there previously and now. So let me just pop up a interesting. Where's that gone? 1 second. I do have some slides here. Zoom will let me show them. There we go. All right. Is that working for you, Caroline? Please nod and smile. Yes, good. Okay, we're good to go. So, hello, I'm James Bridle. I'm a writer and artist, and I'm going to talk about a couple of the works that have appeared at the Zeppelin Museum before as part of my kind of wider practice and what I do. I wanted to start actually with these because I threw them in at the end because this is the Zeppelin Museum, and I wanted to talk briefly about balloons and other aerial structures that I've actually used quite a lot in my work. These pictures are from some workshops. This particular one is from a workshop in Portugal, gosh, almost 10 years ago. But I've done very many similar ones. And my interest here is in this case, we were using balloons to map the city of Guimarães. And what this means is we had these large balloons and we put cameras on them and kind of walked them around the city so that people could make their own maps. And this is a work, like much of my work, that is about a kind of public access to technology, but not just to the technology itself, but to the viewpoint that technology gives us. So the view from above is one of these really key ways of seeing the world that is made possible by various technologies, but because of the nature of the way technology is owned, distributed, and created, it's a view that's also tends to be restricted to small groups of people, to the wealthy, to people with certain types of knowledge. And so in a lot of my work, a big part of the work is making that, not just the technology itself, but the way of seeing the world that it enables and the things that result from that accessible to more people. And so a really good example of this is hanging a camera off a large balloon and flying it over a city in order to take high resolution aerial pictures, which are usually only available to people who own planes or satellites. So it's seeing how technology can democratize certain ways of seeing the world, that technology also has a role in usually removing from the abilities of most people to do. It's an example of the kind of high resolution aerial imagery we became able to make through this very simple thing of just tying a camera onto a balloon. And I've used these kind of weird high-tech, low-tech approaches in other ways. This is another blimp that I flew over London a few years ago in a project called The Right to Flight. And that everything's in that title. It's the right to flight. Who has the right to kind of access the atmosphere and to see what you can see from up there, to have this kind of overview, God's eye vision of the world that comes with a huge amount of kind of responsibility and power, essentially. Who has the power to access the sky, to use the information that's kind of gainable from there? And how do the rest of us investigate that as well, access it as well, take back some of that power that has been, you know, that is held by those who have this kind of privileged access to technology. So I just wanted to throw those balloon examples in at the beginning as kind of examples of doing this. And if you want, we can talk more about that in the Q&A. And also particularly, I have some very strong feelings about the relationship between these balloons that I'm using here and the very different kind of technology that I'm going to talk about slightly more length now, which is the drone. Drones have been a kind of constant presence, a constant shadow over my work for some time, for more than a decade now. And they have this particular place because they embody something which for me is absolutely central to the way that technology operates in the world. The ways that I've been talking about it before, the ability of technology to both give us access to extraordinary points of view, extraordinary new knowledges, and at the same time to kind of centralize that knowledge, to make it powerful for smaller groups, to make it into a weapon that can be used against the more vulnerable, the less fortunate, the less knowable. And so when I first heard about drones more than a decade ago, and to be clear, I'm talking here about the kind of drone you see in this image, military drones, which these kind of huge flying creations, not the little kind of like hobbyist things, so they have a place within this argument as well. When I first heard about these drones, I was completely blown away. You know, because when we first started hearing about them, we didn't really know very much about them. They've actually been around for kind of 20 more years, but they were highly secret and certainly not much discussed. And yet they're completely extraordinary. They are flying robots. They are purely something out of extraordinary science fiction, and they have this incredible power. They're military machines, incredibly violent, powerful military machines, with the capability for full automation. They are flying death robots. They can fly to almost any point in the world and rain death down below. And they can do this with almost complete impunity. And they've completely revolutionized warfare in multiple ways. And yet, at the time that I started to become interested in them, and frankly, still, there didn't seem to be very much public discussion about them. There seemed to be a huge change in the material conditions of the world, that there was both the presence of flying death robots encircling the globe in the command of a few military powers, and also that this could be done with a kind of impunity, and that this was revolutionizing warfare at the same time, which seemed to speak to this strange again, I keep repeating this, but it speaks to this strange paradox within technology of kind of incredible change, incredible novelty, and in the ability to kind of hide that away or control it at the same time. And I realized there was it seemed to me that invisibility of these machines, the fact that they were not discussed much in the public was a huge problem, like it is with possibly many technologies. The not just the knowledge of their existence, not just the knowledge of how they work, but the very knowledge of their existence was somehow, maybe not even intentionally, but was being kept from the public. And I wanted to figure out how to change that. But first of all, I wanted to know more about it myself. And it was so hard to know about these things. And this quality of something being hard to know came down to me to be a very simple physical thing. That I wanted to imagine what it would be like to stand next to one of these things, to stand in front of it, to literally be in its presence, to touch it, to measure the scale of my own body against it. Because we see these images, like the image I'm showing you now, but it doesn't give us a physical sensation of the thing. And for me, that physical encounter is very important. We have fairly simple brains, basically. We're bad generally at the kind of abstractions and easily fooled. And so if you want to know about a thing, the best thing to do is to stand in front of it. And this is a thing you cannot stand in front of. If you're unfortunate, you may stand some distance below it, but you can't have this kind of direct bodily encounter. And so I tried to manufacture one in the most simple way that I could imagine, which is that I took the simple plans of one of these things off the internet, the absolute barest outline. And I went into the car park kind of behind my studio in London, and with a piece of chalk and some measuring tape, we sketched out on the ground just the size of this thing. All I wanted to know was how big it was, right? Flying death robot, like automated plane, military weapon. And I just want to know, how big is this thing? Because all I've seen are pictures. And the immediate thing, the thing that also everyone else says when you first encounter them, is like, oh, I had no idea how big it was. Because it is. It's this the example you're seeing now is a Predator drone, which is now a quite sort of like outdated one, and is small as these things go, but it's still the size of a regular light aircraft. And just that reaction alone, like, oh, I had no idea how big this was. It's like that in itself is a quite strange thing that exists in the world, and yet to realize we have no sense of just their physical scale, that being a starting point. And from that, all kinds of other questions start to fall out. Like, oh, you didn't know how big it was. Like, do you know what it can do? Do you know how it functions? Do you know who it belongs to? Like, how did I know so little about this thing that is shaping the world? They very much do shape the world. They have shaped the way military conflicts are enacted in the present and the shape of geopolitics itself. And so I continued to draw these things around the world. This is a Predator drone in Istanbul. This is a Reaper drone in Washington, D.C. This is actually on the street that borders the White House. I deliberately painted it so it was flying away so that it wasn't so too direct a threat. But what rapidly became obvious is that the quality of the drone shadow that most reflects the quality of the drone itself and everything else is its invisibility. That this is a machine that was designed to be invisible on multiple levels. It was designed to be physically invisible, in that it is, hidden away in military bases and highly classified, but also even in flight, it can fly up to kind of 50,000 feet or more. It's invisible to the naked eye. It can carry on its work without being physically seen. But critically, it's also politically invisible. It allows for a kind of warfare that kind of escapes from the restrictions that visibility forces upon it. So it allows for secret wars. It allows politicians to conduct politicians and nation states to conduct warfare outside of public scrutiny. There's no body bags coming back. There's no casualties on our side if one of these things go down. So there's a kind of unaccountability built into the warfare. And these things permit new kinds of warfare based on that particular invisibility. And they transform the nature of warfare. They come out of a very particular context, which is largely the Israel-Palestine conflict, which is where they were kind of first developed and tested, which was a conflict designed to take place within civilian populations, not on what we would historically consider to be a battlefield, but actually is general urban life, and by then using these machines elsewhere, they then take all the morals or lack of them of that particular conflict and spread them over the entirety of the globe. And it transforms the entire world into a battlefield. But with one crucial distinction, which is that we still don't have images of this place as a battlefield. We still don't see it as a battlefield because the objects that are perpetrating this warfare remain invisible. There's no legible images of them. And so this is why the drone shadow, this is why it's a thing that allows you to, at the very least, start a conversation about the existence of a thing that you cannot see. This is in Germany, this is in London, and this is at the Zeppelin Museum, where one was drawn a couple of years ago. There's several other aspects of the drone shadow. One key bit being that I decided what I call an open source artwork. That is, it's available for anyone to make. I've released the plans. Anyone can draw one of these things, which is lovely. I don't have to do it anymore, but anyone else can take these and use them, which means that it sort of takes on a life of its own, as well as at kind of arts institutions and elsewhere. They've been used as kind of educational tools. This is in a Dutch school, which is just magic. And people have also taken them and used them in protest situations as well. So the artwork itself can kind of spread and take on its own meanings and kind of repeat itself elsewhere, which is a thing that I really love about it. And the key thing here, or one of the many key things, is that what is being drawn when one draws the drone shadow is not just the shape of the drone. What is key about the drone is that it's really just the pointy end of a vast network of technological systems. So the drone is always connected. The drone exists because of satellite base stations and kind of radio relays and people sitting in command control rooms far, far away. And in that way, it kind of mirrors broader network technologies as well. And it's also an attempt to draw a diagram of the political systems that result from that. As I say, the drone as a weapon of war has radically shifted what's possible in warfare. But it also keys into all kinds of other weird parts of politics that you wouldn't necessarily expect, but are suddenly brought into view when you try and draw it. This example is a drone that never got drawn. This is my kind of planning sketch for it. This is from Australia a few years ago, where I was invited to draw one in Brisbane, Australia. And this was essentially censored. I got there and then was basically told various ways that I wasn't allowed to draw it. And this was because I didn't even know at the time that this was going on, but actually Australia was near an election in which immigration was a huge issue, and where the sale of Australia was considering purchasing drones in order to patrol its maritime borders, i.e. to stop refugees from reaching the Australian mainland, and was using drones to do this. So drones were a hot political topic. I didn't even know about that before starting to do this. I was still thinking about wars in Europe and Asia. But by sketching this thing out, suddenly the contours of a much larger and more contentious system were revealed. And so that, as I said, the drone is the pointy end of this kind of technological system, but it's kind of also an entry point into many different kind of political questions and things that people would rather not discuss, or questions of what can be represented artistically. It's always had this kind of incredible kind of fecundity for me that I've really appreciated. And yeah, and to get into the second part of what I'm going to be talking about, what I realized is that drones stands in for all technological systems, which are hard for us to see, that have potentially dangerous uses, that also have potentially benign uses in terms of kind of crisis response or emergency mapping or just generally information systems, depending on how they're tuned. Depending on who uses them, who has access to them, who knows about them, who understands them, and who has power over them and with them. These are always the questions we have to ask about technology. Who knows about it, who controls it, who's building it, whose will is being enacted through it. And it stands as this kind of, this connected object, full of kind of fear, uncertainty, and largely invisible most of the time, and yet has this huge impact on the world. And in that, it resembles the kind of largest, most impactful, and yet somehow most invisible technology of our time, which is the internet itself. This is this building I'm showing an image of now is one I look at a lot and I think about a lot. This, again, around the same time, almost 10 years ago now, I was walking around East London, where I used to live. And I looked up and I saw this building and I had no idea what it was. But it was kind of fascinating to me because it looked like sort of industrial building, but it was very contemporary. It had this weird kind of pixelation going on the front. And I did some research and I discovered that this was the internet, or at least a very significant node of it. This and several other buildings that surround it is the main internet access point for the entirety of the UK and a significant part of Europe. About 90% of all the UK's internet traffic and a significant amount of Europe's traffic in general passes through this suite of buildings. It's an incredibly significant point at which a bunch of different cables come together and huge amounts of everything that we do on the internet passes through this building. And it sort of looks like the internet. The architects have tried to make this like an internet-y building, which is kind of amazing. Most of the buildings of the internet, which are very real, look more like this. They look like kind of very large blank sheds, and this is because this is not the face of the internet, and the internet is also kind of precious and slightly vulnerable if you know where all its buildings are, and so it has to be protected. This building is actually the one I'm showing you now. Is not a central node of the internet, but a very important one. This is the New York Stock Exchange's European data center, which is just outside London. Billions and billions or trillions of financial transactions pass through this building every single day. And yet it's kind of completely unmarked and largely hidden in the landscape. And if you get too near it and take photos like I did, security guards will come out and get angry with you. But I'm fascinated by these places. I'm fascinated by them because I think if we're to understand the role of technology in the world, the transformative role that the internet in particular plays in our daily lives, we need to understand where it comes down to earth. We need to understand who owns it. We need to understand who the computers belong to and what they're doing, because so much of this is constantly hidden from us, just as the operation of drones is. The effects of these machines on our lives are not as sudden and violent as the operation of the drone, but they constitute the slow violence of capitalism itself, the secretion of power into an ever smaller number of hands, and the ability to profit on the fact that most people don't really know how things work and what's going on. And a really nice way to illustrate this is to go and visit the places in which it's actually happening, like these kind of large sheds. And so for a number of years now, I and many other artists have kind of explored this bizarre aspect of the internet, or particularly of what has come to be known as the cloud, which is all of the internet that we don't see, which is where everything happens. It's where the data goes. It's where the information is. It's where the decisions are made. It's where everything is stored and processed, and it's called the cloud. This kind of magical numinous place that's far away and that we don't have to think about, but actually exists like this in large sheds on the edges of the city, owned by large companies, and existing within like national, state, and legal jurisdictions. And all of those details matter deeply on our everyday lives. And there's ways of exploring and trying to understand that, are ways of trying to kind of peel back and try to understand, and perhaps at some point, as with the mapping balloons, insert ourselves back into these circuits of power in some way that might be somewhat kind of restorative or restitutive. So this is the story of another artwork, which relates to these questions of the cloud, and questions of data and who has it and what it does to us. Because we often we often struggle to imagine, when we're told that who has your data, who processes it, where it belongs, who owns it, we struggle to imagine how those things really matter, and what they really mean to us, and what it means, for example, when our personal data is traded, or when our privacy is invaded, or when we are surveilled. Well, what does that actually mean? This for me is a particularly concrete example. Most of us, certainly not all, are lucky enough to have a citizenship, right? A citizenship embodied in the passport means that we are recognized by a state as an individual holding certain rights and protections within the embodiment of the state. Hannah Arendt, one of the kind of greatest commentators on these questions, who really explored what it means to have rights and what rights do, what human rights are. She said that citizenship was the right to have rights. We can talk all we like about human rights and their importance, but in the society in which we live, only the state exists to grant us those rights. Without the protection of the state, there is no guarantor of our rights, and our rights become meaningless. So the citizenship embodied in a passport as membership of a state means we have the rights that we do, and without them we are naked. We are alone on the earth and unprotected. And this is the situation today for millions of people, for refugees and stateless people, who exist in this state where their rights are not recognized because they do not have a stable citizenship. Most of us, I think I'm speaking both numeric to the world and probably to most people in this conversation, are lucky enough to have a citizenship as something they can most of the time rely on. States are certainly not infallible, but it counts for something to have the citizenship. And it's embodied in this document, and we consider it to be something stable and certain. And there's various kind of regimes of citizenship and ways of accessing it, but it exists. Something very strange, I started to become aware of this thing, that was something very strange, that was a kind of side note that fell out of the Snowden revelations, however many years ago now. This huge kind of flood of documents that was released by Edward Snowden from the National Security Agency in the US. This thing that was listening to everything we said, looking at our pictures online, all of this kind of stuff. This incredible kind of tidal wave of information that flowed out of the Snowden links. One of the things that Snowden revealed was that the NSA had a system for determining people's citizenship that wasn't based on their passports. What this means is, so the NSA is an American organization, and so they are nominally bound by the laws of the United States, just as we are as citizens of a country. And one of those laws was that they weren't allowed to surveil American citizens. Right? They're a foreign intelligence agency, so they're not allowed to surveil American citizens. Unfortunately, they weren't able to look at anyone's passport when they decided to tap the undersea cables or listen into mobile phone calls or read your emails or any of that stuff. So they had to make a determination based on the data of it. So they looked, in the way that surveillance and security agencies do, at all the information they could find about you online. And they said, well, this person seems to be dialing in from here and they're accessing this email server here and blah, blah, blah. So we'll give them a score. We'll say on this day, the balance of probability is that they're 60% American and 40% something else. And on that determination, they would decide whether to invade that person's privacy, because that's what it is. They decide whether or not to read your email, to track you, to listen into your pillow talk, whatever it is. It'll be based on that assertion. But because that is a determination being made by computers, it becomes uncertain. It becomes unsteady. This thing that we think of as being very fixed, which is citizenship, becomes something that is determined by a balance of probabilities calculated by a machine. And there's a scholar called John Cheney Lippold who wrote about this. He described this as being an algorithmic citizenship. So the way in which we've become accustomed today to everything about us being kind of filtered down into little bits of data, our age and our height and our sexual preferences and what we bought last week and what we said in an email to someone else. And the way that gets channeled and broken up and sold to some people or used to recommend adverts to us as well, our citizenship becomes one of those things as well. And the meaning of that is that our rights become one of those things as well. Remember I said that citizenship is the right to have rights. And citizenship stops becoming something that is determined by your place of birth or your legal status or even your passport, and it becomes something that is assigned to you by a machine and that is possible to change from one moment to another based on your behavior. So it stops being this certain thing, and your rights stop being a certain thing. Your rights, again, become something that can be assigned depending on what data you give to the machine, how you behave, all of these questions. And this is a fundamental change to governance and how we perceive citizenship as a whole. And so I built a tool to try and understand that better, because a lot of what I said I know is quite complicated stuff. I hope it's understandable, but it's a lot of information. So I built a thing called Citizen X to illustrate this in the way that hopefully the drone shadows illustrate the size of those killer robots. Citizen X is a piece of software you download and install on your computer, and it watches you browse. To be very clear, it doesn't share that data. It stays on your computer. That turns out to be incredibly hard to do. We spent a lot of time, most of the design of this artwork involved working out how not to surveil people, how not to break people's privacy and trust, because that is the default of pretty much all technology connected to the internet. It's actually very, very difficult to make something for the internet that doesn't invade people's privacy and break their trust. And I think that's we could maybe, again, a thing for the Q&A, but like, it's frightening how many artworks that attempt to deal with this do precisely that. But that's my own personal bugbear. Citizen X watches you browse. It shows you for any website you visit. So in this occasion, you see I visited bbc.com, the BBC website, called down Citizen X, and it says, oh, look, the internet thinks you're at this location, and this is the location of the place that you're visiting. So it shows you, like with the data sensors I showed earlier, the physical location of you and of the information that you're accessing, as the internet understands it. The NSA probably knows better, but this was the best I could do. And then it shows you what your algorithmic citizenship looks like. Oh, well, today you spent 57.7% of your time on US websites, on UK websites, on Chinese websites. This is what an algorithmic citizenship based on your behavior actually looks like. Now, this is massively simplified from what the NSA does, but it shows, I think, the extraordinary international nature of accessing information this way, and map out what those relationships looks like. It shows that we are, the internet itself is something that is inherently kind of not stateless, but extends kind of across and beyond states in really, really interesting ways. And it also shows the dominance of certain sectors. You will spend most of your time in the US because that is a cultural dominance of this kind of technology. And you may also be able to change your behaviors based on this, I hope, in kind of interesting ways. I have heard people say, I don't know how to do this, is that they try to browse more locally as a result. And these behaviors matter. It's a very simple thing, but when we make these behaviors legible, they actually become things that we can change. And one of the things we can do to change the power relationships within technology is to change the way we use technology itself. Again, maybe one for later. But knowing the shape of the network allows you to change it, allows you to act in different ways. And by changing the shape of the network, we change the way that power is distributed, right? Power is embodied in the network in very powerful ways. And we have the power to change the shape of that network. That's very key. And this, again, is possibly a tool for doing this. So this started as an online browser. It's now accessible. You can go and kind of use it in museums and play with it in this kind of way. And it throws up interesting stuff wherever it's used. And you get this access to the shape of the network in really interesting ways, and start to kind of have this kind of sense of it as a tangible physical thing. And that simply means as a thing that affects your life, which is important for you to know, but also perhaps as a thing that you can affect in return. Just as with the balloons and the little cameras flying over the city, like, you have the same access to this as everybody else does, and that's really key. One final part of this that I want to talk about is alongside CitizenX, the browser tool, or the thing in the museum you can use if you go along to the exhibition and use this to explore the internet, is some of the stories we told behind it. So these can be found on citizenx.com. And they tell the story of some weird bits of the history and its relation of the history of the internet, and its relationship to geography and power. And again, it's about breaking down the idea of technology and the internet as something kind of neutral or supernatural, and connecting it very deeply to the politics of the state and the politics of everyday life. And to do this, I use the example of domain names, the bit that comes after the dot at the end of a domain name, that particularly the geographical ones that situate them within particular places, because there's really fascinating stories here. And the stories that I tell on here are .ly, which refers to Libya, .sy, which is Syria, .scot, .cymru, sorry Welsh people, which refer to Scotland and Wales, .u, which refers to the former Yugoslavia, and .io. So for an example, .sy, it refers to Syria, which is interesting because Bashar al-Assad used to be in charge of the internet, like very directly within Syria. He founded the Syrian Institute of Technology, which had the rights to administer .sy. So it's very interesting that one of the most larger and currently important websites in the art world used to run off one of these domains. When they found out about this, to their credit, they removed it. But this is a website called Artsy, which is now at artsy.net, but used to be at art.sy. And so that they were one of the most, because it sounded cool, right? And they didn't think about it because the internet doesn't match geography, except when it does, and except when your art website is founded on paying money to an institute founded by Bashar al-Assad. This is one of the weird effects that occurs when the real world and the internet world are separated and seen to be not kind of in line with each other. Though the bigger example, the one that I am slightly more interested in, is the example of the British Indian Ocean Territory. This is an example for me of when technology can give us an insight into and draw attention to a much bigger and more important story, but one that remains kind of fascinating to me. So there's another domain. When I talk about domains, I mean like .com, .net, .edu, .sy. This one's .io. .io is very popular with technology companies because IO relates to input output. It sounds kind of techy. So there's lots and lots of websites out there that end .io. But IO actually stands for Indian Ocean, and which is short for British Indian Ocean Territory, which is a real place. It's an archipelago of hundreds, if not thousands, of little islands, kind of halfway between India and Africa, that belong in law to Britain. They used to include places like the Seychelles and Mauritius, which were given, or which took their independence kind of 60, 70 years ago now, and Britain quietly held on to a set of these little islands. This has been highly, highly contentious, not least because when they held on to those islands, they evicted several thousand people who'd lived there for some time, who are known as the Chagossians. One of the other names for the British Indian Ocean territory is the Chagossian Islands. It was home to the Chagos Islanders. They were put on ships, mostly at gunpoint, and shipped to Mauritius and Reunion, so Mauritius and Seychelles, kind of dumped on the docks, and they're still fighting to get back to their home. And the reason that Britain held on to these islands is because they're strategically very important. If you haven't heard of Biot or Chagos, you might have heard of Diego Garcia. Diego Garcia is the central atoll of the territory. It's a huge UK and US military base. It's where they dock nuclear submarines and aircraft carriers. It also seems incredibly likely that it was a CIA black site. So this is a place in which people were tortured during the War on Terror. And of course, it's the perfect place to do it. It's a now uninhabited island apart from military personnel in the middle of the Indian Ocean. And this is the place that loads of tech websites have as their physical address. And I'm fascinated by this relationship between a completely invisible neuronal network and a very real located place. One of the many horrific things that the British government did in connection with the British Indian Ocean territory is they've denied, not specifically that torture has taken place there, but denied all knowledge of it. And one of the ways they've done that is by claiming that all records relating to the arrival or departure of flights that may have been carrying people who were to be tortured were lost. And specifically, they'd been destroyed by water damage. They'd become wet and therefore unreadable. They had, to some extent, waterboarded the information as much as the people, which for me is what connects back these questions of access to information to real and actual qualitative violence upon people. There's a violence being done to information in terms of the British government claiming that the information itself had been destroyed, even though it was later proven not to have been, and the actual violence that is done to human beings, just as there is a connection between the occlusion of understanding of how technology functions, how the domain name system function, how drone system function, how the internet functions more broadly, and also questions of political violence and state violence that are constantly being perpetrated. All of these are questions of access to information and access to knowledge and access to understanding and part of similar types of inequalities. And the way for me to access and kind of think about those is to broaden the access to that information in every single way possible. Because the thing that is constantly being performed by state power, by oppressive politics, and by most of the technologies that we engage in every day is the willful withdrawal of information and knowledge and understanding. But at the same time, we can reach out to them. We can have access to them, whether that's the information about how things work, whether that's kind of mapping the internet, whether that's, in the case of .io, literally typing the commands in our computer into the computer in front of you to map the route that will take you from the computer that you're sitting at to this island which has been forcibly depopulated and used for torture. The knowledge is here and present, and it only needs to be kind of drawn out and acted upon and shared. And yeah, I think I'll stop there and go to Q&A. So thank you very, very much indeed for giving me the opportunity. And I look forward to having some more questions in chat.
Thank you very much, James, for this interesting lecture. And I hand over to Ina. Do we have any questions from the community?
Yes, there are actually two questions. And the first one is focusing on drones.
Mm-hmm.
So the question is, are these drones shadows rather subversive interventions, or were there official permissions for these drawings?
They vary. When I've done them as artistic projects, you know, there may have been an institutional museum collaborating, then they've been done with official permission. And that's often been a long period of negotiation and difficult. Okay, sorry, someone just dropped out, but I'm still here. I'm still here, right?
Yes, I think so.
Good, okay, good. Yeah, so there's sometimes been a long kind of period of negotiation with some slightly bizarre requests, but it's happened. But as I also said, sometimes they've been used, they've been done without permission, and including without my permission, which I'm very happy about. And so they have been done as part of protests, and in other kind of contexts where permission hasn't been granted. And also, as the case of Australia, permission has not been granted quite explicitly at other times.
Yeah, and there's another question. It is about algorithmic citizenship. And the question is algorithmic citizenship the citizenship of the future? And will it replace traditional citizenships like birthright citizenship?
Yeah, this is a really fascinating kind of question, because I think when I set out to make Citizen X, I was genuinely interested in this question kind of as a possibility, really. In what cases might this be useful? So, you know, what at the moment, to be clear, algorithmic citizenship is kind of a conceptual thing, and it's also a thing that's being imposed on people. So it's a thing that's being used more broadly to remove people's rights than to give it to them, in the case of the kind of NSA. But it's possible to think of cases in which it might be useful. I think of this particularly as a citizen of the UK who lives in Europe and has gone through Brexit, and that being a case in which you could really see a system that was based on people having different levels of access and kind of different voting rights, and being able to show and display their kind of engagement with different systems. Well, you know, I should have a vote in this, and this person should have a vote in this other thing, even though we're not full citizens in this way. You could see a kind of partial system being useful and interesting there. But I think as I went on, I became less and less certain about it, because ultimately the system that is based on it, which is our system of rights, should be non-negotiable. Our rights shouldn't be based on our citizenship at all. They should be, and you know, they should be universal as they have been declared to be. So I don't see a system of algorithmic citizenship being one in which those rights are more guaranteed and actually enable us. I think we will see situations in which things like this are attempted to be deployed, and I think we should resist them as much as possible, because what we should be searching for is a system in which these things are, in which, as I say, rights are completely non-negotiable and absolutely universal, rather than being partial and subject to change, which is what happens when they are fed into algorithmic systems.
Okay, thank you.
Or maybe there's another follow-up question on this. What do you think about e-citizenship like Estonia has established?
So this is super interesting. E-citizenship is not quite the same thing as digital citizenship. For those who don't know, Estonia has for the last 10 years or so established a system which is called e-citizenship, which is basically where you can be an online citizen of the country. It's really clear, it's important to know how this really has nothing to do with citizenship. This is, it essentially allows you to lose their business and banking and tax services. So it's an identity system, which is the precondition for most citizenship systems. In that, you know, you are recognized as an individual by the state of Estonia, but very critically and specifically, you're not granted any residency rights. You're not granted any human rights. You're essentially recognized as a corporation and not as a human, and that's a whole other kettle of fish. But Estonia is super interesting in this in other ways, because it is an incredibly, it comes into a lot of the other points that I've made, because it is one of the most allegedly wired states on earth. So it has digitized its government and its relationships with both real and e-citizens to an extraordinary extent, which has brought up a whole bunch of interesting questions. One of the things is it's regularly subject to cyber attacks that probably, certainly, definitely originate from Russia, which make it kind of uniquely vulnerable, both digitally and physically. So, for example, when you have put your entire citizenship, your entire citizenry, your entire society into digital systems, that makes them very vulnerable, because you can wipe out a country just by wiping out its hard drives, right? That when your entire legacy and society is contained digitally, it's vulnerable to digital means. So one of the things that Estonia has done is back itself up in other nations. I know it does have a large data center in Luxembourg, which it uses for kind of national backup. I've also been told there's a large backup repository in the UK somewhere. And that then begs the question, like, what is the legal status of these data centers? Are they like embassies? Are they like the national territory of those countries? At which point does the kind of the data, the information of these states take on the same qualities as kind of ambassadors and citizens themselves? And it also reinforces what I was saying earlier about this physical nature of the cloud. Like the idea is that by digitizing something, you kind of remove all these questions, but you actually make them much more kind of sharper and kind of more important to think about.
Yeah, that's really
a lot. Sorry.
No, no worries. That's really interesting because Estonia has the e-citizenship, but you can also buy citizenships, and we found this out during our preparation for the exhibition. And I was really surprised that this is possible. And so do we have to rethink national identity, maybe? What do you think?
I mean, personally, I really hope we rethink national identity, and I want to see the end of the nation state. But the thing that replaces that remains very much up in the air. What we're really seeing at the moment is, again, the way in which technology, hides this stuff. Whereas what we're actually seeing at the moment is a huge, concretization and solidification of the nation state. Passports are a recent invention. Citizenship, as we currently understand it, is a recent invention. You didn't have to carry a passport until very recently in world history. They're really an invention. The systems we have now are an invention of the 20th century. And they will undoubtedly change again into other systems. But at the moment, we're mostly building walls, and those walls are as much kind of technological or as physical. And so, and the example you use of the sale of citizenships is an example of how that is stratified by wealth and power and class, in that the wealthy can freely move around the globe purchasing access to various places, just as you would purchase the kind of upgrades or privileges online. That's another example really for me of this relationship between technology and citizenship. Once you start to break it down into these ways, into things that can be assigned by data, it becomes even more exploitable by the rich and the powerful. So I mean, several of these questions are basically touching upon the same broader thing. It's basically, will technology make this thing, in this case citizenship, whatever, better or worse? And the answer is, what matters is who has the power and the stake in the technology itself. The technology itself can do any of these things, can switch it one way or another. But I guarantee you that if the technology remains in the hands of the rich and powerful, it will accrue to the benefits of the rich and powerful, and be worse for the rest of us, and be most worse for the most vulnerable. But as I said all along, that doesn't always have to be that way. And we do have ways of changing our power relationships within these networks through our own actions and of course through concerted actions, whether that's large scale kind of political cooperation or whether it's just the kind of individual actions that we perform every day.
There's one question, it's maybe you answered part of it already, but I want to ask you, aside from the Citizen X concept, how do you think digital technology will influence future concepts of state and citizenship?
I don't know. Honestly, I think people vary hugely in the way in which technology is acting upon their feelings towards states. I think that's what I can best say at the present. Because on the one hand, technology in the case of this next, technology has this potential to render us all stateless in the worst way, in that we become lacking our citizenship and therefore the rights that surround it. It also renders a lot of us stateless in the sense that we no longer identify with the geographical political framework in which we actually live our daily lives, that we feel more connected to places and cultures and groups that are physically remote from us. And that's a very, very powerful thing that technology does. But once again, then it depends which one of those groups you choose to identify with. It doesn't change the calculus of politics. It gives you access to a different set of beliefs, but those beliefs might still be terrible. I think for me, there's kind of there's no technological answer to these questions. Every question of technology at sufficient scale is a question of politics. Technology, the internet, both gives us a window into what a kind of post-state world would look like, but at the moment, the next thing up from states is corporations, and particularly the kind of large corporations, social media or investment firms or any of these things. So, and at the present, the state is our best protector against those things. They have mixed feelings about the EU, but it's the only thing that stood up to, for example, Google's invasion of privacy or kind of large-scale financial manipulation, and is itself something that is post the state, right? And the European Union is a glimpse of what a post-state future looks like, and it's the thing that is also most closely engaged with fighting the battles of kind of corporate technological dominance that most states are kind of too afraid to get deep into. So maybe there's something emerging there in those kind of transnational organizations. But transnational is a key. I curated an exhibition a few years ago called Transnationalisms that explored the ways in which technology was kind of doing weird things to states, was kind of corrupting and changing the ways in which they operated, through some of the examples I've given and kind of others. And the best examples of those were ones where this kind of other possibilities for states that largely involve the same kind of old solidarities that political action has always required became kind of suddenly visible.
Okay. And does algorithmic citizenship change our understanding of borders and states?
Okay, I've got to think of another way to answer this question. I would hope the one where it changes it is it says that like being inside the border won't help you. What has happened in the last, it's been happening for a while, let's say, is that what we understand as the physical border no longer applies. The idea was that one idea is the internet renders the world borderless, right? The contrary to that is it makes the entire world into a border zone. And what I mean specifically by that is the border zones are those zones in which the normal rules don't apply, This is the zone of algorithmic citizenship, where you're constantly kind of crossing over a border where extra police powers are granted, where authority is unclear, where you're not sure whether the person in power is wearing the right uniform, but they seem to have a truncheon anyway, where the world actually becomes something substantially blurrier. I've called this in the past the kind of electromagnetic border. It's a place into which we're all disappearing quite quickly, where everything is kind of calculated and judged, where there's no such thing as public space. There's just only these kind of spaces of uncertainty and places of kind of extra legal judgment. So no, is my short answer. The world in which we largely operate is an increasingly bordered one, and one that is increasingly a border zone.
And there's one question from the community. What are your future projects?
Future projects, that's a much better question, because this is all dark and horrible. Yeah, can I speak briefly about that? I have I've mostly been working on a book for another while, which is kind of a follow-up to New Dark Age, in the sense that Caroline very kindly mentioned that book at the beginning of this, which contains a lot of this thinking, this book New Dark Age, which is about essentially the horrors of technology. It's not an easy read. And it's also not everything that I think about technology. And so I've been trying to think for a while about where possibly we go from this. And the place that I decided to go from that was to start exploring the relationship between technology and ecology. As I've said throughout this talk, one of the illusions of technology is it's kind of separate from what we might call the real world, or the land or the earth. And now seems like a pretty good time to start to reestablish those connections. And so I've been looking at questions of why, for example, we're so obsessed with the idea of artificial intelligence. Just as science, particularly biological sciences, have been revealing over the last 20 years, the extraordinary intelligences that exist all around us all the time in the animal, plant, and other kingdoms. And what we could learn if instead of obsessing over artificial intelligence, and particularly over the qualities of artificial intelligence that make it seem like human intelligence, we started to regard it as something that was more like another kind of intelligence, either its own or something that resembled animal or plant intelligence in various ways. And essentially the project is trying to recapture or to find a way through an ecology of technology, a technology that is actually connected to the earth and responsible to it in the ways that we need to be, in the ways that we need to be responsible to one another, that sees technology as being a part of the earth's kind of abundance and flowering, rather than as a tool for asserting dominance and control over it. And that'll be out next year, hopefully.
Good. That sounds good. So I think we're at the end of our talk. Thank you so much, James. It was really great.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to talk with you guys.
Before we end our live stream, I would like to recommend our next one with my colleague Frauke Stengel, who will talk with Guilherme Caneva about his book Unrecognized Nations, Travels to Countries That Do Not Exist. Sounds also very interesting. So thank you and see you next time.